Hello and welcome to a drive-by code session. Um, this episode is going to be a continuation of the first episode on async await. This is the second in the series, and again, WhiteKit has created some code examples for me to I'm going to replay his code examples and use that to demonstrate some async await features. This episode, we're gonna look at how AJAX or HTTP requests work with async await. Again, we're gonna be using TypeScript. The examples are written in TypeScript, but if you are fluent in JavaScript, you should be able to follow along no problem. And also, these examples use the JSON server, which is a tool for quickly setting up a fake REST API for prototyping ideas for front-end developers. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So we're going to be using jQuery to make AJAX requests. So a standard AJAX request with jQuery is made like this using the $.get API, the URL here, and then a callback function. So if we ran this, we'll get an array back. So this array has got a couple of objects in it. Each of them is a project, which has an ID, the project name, and a team ID. And the next thing we want to do is render these projects onto the page inside of an untitled list. So one way of doing that might be loop through using array.map, loop through the projects and render an li tag for each of them, and then stuff the dynamically generated HTML into the projects tag. And now we have these projects as a list on the page now. Okay, now how do we convert this code or rewrite this code using the async await feature? Well, the first thing we would want to do is to hook into JavaScript, hook into jQuery's promises support. So this get method, in fact, does support promises as long as we use it the correct way, which is if we choose to use it the callback style, it's totally happy to allow us to use it the callback style. But we could also choose to use it in the promise style, which is like this. So if we use it in the promise style, which means there's no callback. If there's no callback, then this guy, the return value of the get, this guy is actually a promise that has some data in it. And the way with a promise, the way to unbox the data and make it available to our application is by using this then callback. And then the data will be provided to us via this function parameter. However, now that we have async await, we could write this guy differently using what else? Async await. So as you remember from the first episode, first we need an async function in order to be able to use the await feature, and then we just call this same API here, like so. We call it here, and then now again this guy gives you a promise of the data, and now to unbox the data we just await, and when it'll wait, async await will wait for this request the response to come back, and then when it does, it'll just hang here while it's going, and then when it finally does, it'll take this data, unbox it, and put it in this variable where you wanted it. And so now this code can be more straightforward, and this code for generating the HTML is identical to the code that we used to have inside this callback function here. And now if we call this main function, and run it, we should get the exact same result. Okay, now let's say we needed to make yet another request, this time to get the teams, so that we can figure out for each project what team it belongs to, and we also want to put that onto the page like here. So this is how you would have done it without async await, which is you first make the API call, then use this callback. Whether you use the promise style of then and then a callback, or just put this callback directly in as a parameter, doesn't matter. Either way, you're doing this style of callback based programming. So within the callback, you have to make another API call, which then has yet another callback nested inside of it. And this is where callback based programming can start getting gnarly. Well, this does work. Let's see what the corresponding code for async await looks like. Oh, okay, so this is it. So with async await, all that was needed was to add another line to fetch all of the teams, and then the combination of the data, of the team data and the project data, is done in the identical way as the classic example, but everything is done in a straight line fashion. There's no additional nesting needed to get this behavior. Let's see this code working, and there's the project name, and there is the team name, the team who owns this project. Okay, now let's say you don't want to use jQuery because you think jQuery is a large library, and since you're not really using jQuery for its DOM processing, because maybe you're using an advanced UI framework such as React or Vue or AngularJS, you're not going to use jQuery for this anymore. So a popular choice is the Fetch API. The Fetch API is, at this point, is a pretty recent addition to the native DOM API. And I'll show you how to use async await with the Fetch API. So first thing is we change the $.get to call the Fetch API instead. And now we have some errors here. And the reason for the errors is because if we await the result of the fetch function call, what you actually get is a response object rather than the data that would have been gotten from the response. What you then need to do is ask the response to parse the JSON data within it, which also yields a promise, so you have to await it again. So we'll do that for both of these API calls, like so, and this should do what it did before. So one way to think about it is that this guy here, it is a promise, but not the promise of the data, but a promise of the response. So when you await on it, the response will be taken out of the promise and put here. But then this guy, you have to say response.json to get you a promise of the data here. So this guy, this yellow box here, is a promise to give you the data. So which means, again, you have to do await to get the data out of the promise and put it in your variable here. So this is how you use the Fetch API. There's an additional step which if you do this repeatedly, it can start getting tedious. But in a separate episode, we'll give you an idea for how to get rid of that tedium. The last thing in this episode that we wanted to cover was a common gotcha of using async await, and that is forgetting to write the await keyword. So if you forget to write this await keyword when you have a asynchronous operation here, you remember that the return value of the asynchronous operation, this is a promise of something. If you're expecting the data that's in it, well, in this case, it would be the data. So, right, data. If what you're expecting is the data, but you don't have the data, then you're going to run into issues. In this case, teams is not an array, so you can't do teams.find on it. So if you run this code, it's going to say teams.find is not a function. So that's the kind of error that you might encounter. It might take a while to get used to, but if you get started on writing a lot of code using async await, you might run into these issues. So just remember to whenever you are doing an asynchronous operation like an AJAX call, always remember to await it. That is the end of this drive-by code session. I hope you enjoyed it. And YKit and I are planning to come up with some more material for you in the future, and I hope you join us. Thank you.